Backyard Professor podcast series. Coming at you live from the Rocky Mountains here in Idaho. I'm Kerry Schertz, the Backyard Professor. I get to do more talking, and you get to do more listening and learning. I'm continuing my podcast on the Trinity and some of the ideas about Joseph Smith's teachings about God, the Father, and deityhood, and the potential deification of mankind. All these doctrines are basically taboo to those Christians who want to exclude us from being Christians because we don't accept the doctrine of the Trinity, and we apparently do not understand the biblical basis of God. And yet we argue that our basis of God is biblical and that the Christian basis of God is unbiblical. And in light of that idea, Truman Madsen, in his very nifty little book called Eternal Man, Deseret book published this in 1981, he has something remarkable to say on page 37. He's showing a specific type of problem that the Christian theologian has, and it's rather complex, but the paradoxes are immense. The immaterial Trinity elicited from nothing both material and immaterial substance. The unchanging and unchangeable deity yet changed and changes the whole of reality. A non-temporal and non-spatial deity, literally nowhere and no when, yet created and infused everywhere and everywhen. The all-powerful and all-good simultaneously and yet continuously brought into being not only mankind, but the angels, the demons, and Satan. Moreover, like did not create like. Between the divine and all other natures there was, and is, and always will be an absolute gulf. Because man is utterly other than the divine, his creation required mediators. Thus, through emanation, or through angels who are pure form, bodiless and more than man, yet less than God, or by the speaking of a cosmic word, man came into being. It's in vain to protest that these are radical contradictions, because the creed-upholding Christian will simply reply, of course they are. They belong to the mysteries of the divine, and obviously the finite intellect cannot understand. Thus it is often held that to be mystified is to be edified, and that intellectual confusion is a religious virtue. The teachings of Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, like those of the ancient prophets, are involved in none of these paradoxes. Absolutely none of them. Because these paradoxes are brought about through an analysis, belief, and acceptance, as it were, a melding together of Christianity and Greek philosophy. And now what is so remarkable, in a rather technically worded text, too technical to expound on very clearly here for you, I'd have to read it 50 or 60 more times and break it down, but Norbert Samuelson, in the, let's see, what is this? The Harvard Theological Review, volume 65, this was in 1972, January. The name of his article is that the God of the philosophers is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he shows that we decide, for instance, he asks, how can we decide if in fact Judah Halevi, Pascal, and Martin Buber were right when they asserted that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not the God of the philosophers? First, we must clarify what they were asserting. What they meant was that the purported entity which the biblical Judaic Christian Muslim tradition identifies as God, is not the same entity as the purported entity which the Jewish, Muslim, Christian traditions of philosophy identify as God. It says that on page 1 of his study. It's a very profound, deeply interesting, and yet actually quite difficult paper. It's about 25 pages. But if you can, Harvard Theological Review, Samuel Norbertson has philosophically, analytically demonstrated that the two deities are not the same at all. Now, the reason this is telling is because the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God Joseph Smith proclaimed appeared to him and restored the gospel through the prophet. The God of the philosophers has been adapted by early Christianity way back in the early days. And actually, B.H. Roberts talked about this, Orson Pratt talked about this, but one of the two of the foremost LDS scholars who have brought this out in extensive detail is Richard Hopkins, How Greek Philosophy Corrupted the Christian Concept of God, and his other book, Biblical Mormonism, Responding to Evangelical Criticism of LDS Theology. Hopkins has done an extremely nice job of simplifying the rather complex historical issues on this. And then the other one, of course, is the LDS scholar Blake T. Ostler in his books Exploring Mormon Thought, The Problems of Theism, and the Love of God. This is the second volume in this series of Exploring Mormon Thought about God. This was Greg Colford Books 2006. I will have a chance to recourse both these fine LDS scholars as well. Before I do, though, there's an article that I am just chomping at the bit to get to, and it's going to, I've got to read fast. I've got to go fast because I'm going to read a lot of materials from this particular article. Now, this is also out of the Harvard Theological Review, a very good scholarly journal. This is volume 55, number 1, January 1962. This is by Elab Sherbonir, The Logic of Biblical Anthropomorphism. Now, I've discussed a little bit of his materials on my Mormonism Researched website before, but I want to present this in a podcast form because I'll have recourse to potentially bring in other items that I couldn't on my website. Sherbonir is one of the scholars who was deeply involved as well. Let me get my source here. Looking. Let's see. Reflections on Mormonism. I believe this is it. Truman Madsen put together as an edited volume the Reflections on Mormonism, Judeo-Christian Parallels. This was the BYU Religious Studies Center Symposium in 1978. And Sherbonir has another, Ernest W. Benst has Imago Dei, Man in the Image of God, which is an extremely powerful, interesting paper. And then I believe, yes, here it is. I knew he had an article in Chapter 9, In Defense of